So we're talking about Frank Lloyd Wright's organic architecture, and I'm defining architecture as, metaphorically, the crystallization of a culture in form. So what makes an architecture important is the degree success to which it represents its culture. So when we look at the Renaissance and we have this notion of the emergence of the individual, and then we can think of Palladio's Villa Rotunda as marking the point where that individual stands. So last week we looked at Frank Lloyd Wright in the 20th century and saw how Wright was part of, integrated into, responded to, help create the 20th century. So now let's look at organic architecture. So what does Wright mean by organic architecture? We have lots of tapes of Wright speaking, and we have books that he wrote, and we have transcriptions of his lectures, and he does not give one coherent definition, but he uses the term in a series of ways. So by organic architecture, he means integrated into the site and relating to its natural features, and we can see that in flowing water. Use of natural materials, embodying the democratic American spirit, an architecture of essences, and all of this falls within a larger organic worldview. So if you didn't get all that down, the slides are online, but I'm going to now do them one at a time. So integrated into the site and relating to its natural features. All good architecture is related to its site. If it is poorly related to its site, it's not good architecture. But there can be different ways to relate to the site. So here we have Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, and it is elevated above the site. I would describe it as presenting a humanist view of the human being separate from and above nature. In Flowing Water, we present an approach in which we see the human being integrated into and a part of nature. So that's one of the meanings of organic architecture. Then we've got the term, the use of natural materials. What's wrong with this phrase? What would be an unnatural material? Well, so Wright would then have to be limited to using wood, which he doesn't do. He uses some wood, but he uses a lot of concrete, a lot of bricks. He's not big into steel. Steel's there in the reinforced concrete. It's one of those things where we sort of have a sense of what we mean, but you really can't give a concise definition of this. Here is the first Jacob's House by Frank Lloyd Wright and Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. Well, they both use glass. Mies uses bigger pieces of glass. So we tend to mean, maybe brick and wood as opposed to glass and steel, but they're not very precise definitions. Embodying the democratic American spirit. What do we mean by democratic American spirit? And it doesn't mean voting for the Republican or the Democrat. That's a small part of it, but the America created by the founders and the democratic spirit spoken about by subsequent figures like the Transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, Walt Whitman, is really, would define it as each individual person should be able to identify their inner self, inner motivations, and be able to manifest and express them. So to find out who you are and have the opportunity to live out your own life, as opposed to being a cog in a machine, part of a vast system. So that's sort of what Wright means by democratic American spirit. We can contrast two of Wright's houses, the Roby house and the Hannah house. And yes, they're both red brick, but they're very different. They're expressive of different times, different regions of the country, different clients. And compare that to Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation. I saw Corbu lecture at my school, and he drew a big diagram of this, and he wrote 1,000 people, one entrance. There are a variety of different apartment types, Unité d'Habitation or Marseille block, but it's really seeing everybody, each person as a unit in the whole, rather than each person as a differentiated individual with their own, possibly very different lives. Now we get to the most important, and that is an architecture of essences. So, what do we mean here? Frank Lloyd Wright writes, "What is honor? Not the rules of a code, but the nature of honor. What would be the honor of a brick? That in the brick which makes the brick a brick." Okay, what's going on here? Let's leave that. We'll come back to it, and we'll do one that's a little more going to be easier to explain. So this is Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright's Liebermeister, dear master. Wright worked for Sullivan, and that was his apprentice training as an architect. And Wright's architecture is very different from Sullivan, but they both share a very similar organic philosophy. So Sullivan wrote 3 books, and in the last book, on the last page, he writes, let's start with this. This is, it's calling it a seed. Imagine a peanut, and you split the peanut open, and this is the germ. So this is the part that's going to grow into the plant, the tree, whatever it's going to be. And this provides the food for it to grow until photosynthesis gets going. But this is where we would say the DNA is. It's going to make it be an oak tree or a peanut plant or whatever it's going to be. And Sullivan writes, the germ is the real thing, the seat of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power, the function which is to seek and eventually to find its full expression in form. There's something in here, it's the important thing. And he refers to it several ways. It's the germ, and it's God, the identity. Well, what is the identity? It's the mechanism that manifests the will to power. Who uses the phrase the will to power? It's associated with Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's a very big discussion what he means by that. One way to express it is everything wants to express itself. In other words, I want to project my John Lobell-ness. I want to develop a focused identity. I want to project it. I want it to be out in the world. I want to be recognized for it. I want to get interaction with it. So that's one way to think of it. And then Sullivan is expanding on that idea to say that is true of anything. In other words, he says, the office building wants to be a proud and soaring thing. It wants to project its tallness, its identity, its modernness, its boldness of structure. Steel wants to be in tension, thin and tenuous. Concrete wants to be massive, squat, and work in compression. So whether it's a human being or a tree or an inanimate material, it wants to project itself. That's the will to power. That will to power is a function which is to seek and eventually to find its full expression in form. The office building, the oak tree, the peanut plant, John Lobell, you. Now, there's a philosophical term for this point of view. It's called essentialism. There is in steel an essence. What is the essence of steel? And we want to express that. What is the essence of concrete? And we want to express that. Now, this essentialism is no longer popular in academia. Anybody have any thoughts as to why? Suppose I said, men are essentially strong, bold, assertive. Women are essentially meek, domestic. Wait a minute. I don't accept that. Each individual has their own characteristics. So there's been a rejection of essentialism. Also, there's essentialism in biology where you say, well, what makes a tiger and a lion? There was a notion before Darwin that each species is distinct. And there is the essential lion, the essential tiger. And today we said, no, everybody's got DNA. A little bit more of this DNA, you're a tiger. A little bit more of that DNA, you're a lion. Our DNA is 99% identical with a chimpanzee. We just have a little bit more 21 chromosome, so we get a bigger brain. But it's not like these are distinct things. There's a continuity between all things. So this essentialism is not that popular today in thought, but that's what Wright and Sullivan are projecting. So Wright says, what would be the honor of a brick? What does he mean by honor? He means the will to power. He means the essence. He says it right here. That in the brick which makes the brick a brick. In other words, there's something in the brick which is gathering to it hardness, squareness, redness. No, brick is, if it's hard, square, and red, it's a brick. And this point of view says, no, there's something there before hard, square, and red that gathers that to it. Louis Kahn begins every project by asking, what does this building want to be? So we just got a commission to do a school. So he gathers all the people in his office, or he brings the problem to the design studio where he teaches. Everybody gathers around and they say, okay, we're going to do a school. What is a school? What does a school want to be? Now, there's two problems. And then we say, a school might be a place where it's good to learn. A school is a place where you find out what you want to do for the rest of your life. There could be different answers. But there's two problems with this. And they're real obvious. What are they? It's a building. It can't want to be anything. It's an inanimate thing. And there's an even more obvious one. We haven't built it yet. We haven't even designed it. How can it want to be something when it doesn't even exist? Well, that's Kahn's philosophy. I did a book on Kahn, so if you want to know how he works that out, you can read my book. But basically, he sees around two realms of silence and light. Silence is a realm of potential. So if you build a building, it must have had the potential to exist, otherwise you couldn't have built it. So it's existing in the realm of potential, and it's willing to come into the realm of manifestation, which is the realm of light. And he applies this approach, and since we talked about Frank Lloyd Wright and the brick, Louis Kahn says, if you think of brick and you're consulting the orders, which is the principles whereby they project what they want to be. You say to brick, what do you want, brick? So right away, A, you can talk to the brick, and B, it has a will, a want. Brick says to you, I like an arch. If you say to brick, arches are expensive and I can use a concrete lintel over an opening. What do you think of that, brick? Brick says, I like an arch. So we should respect the material for its nature. In the medical towers, Kahn has poured in place concrete towers. He then puts brick on them as a veneer. He was very embarrassed about that because that's using brick like paint. Bricks build Rome. You don't insult bricks that way. And his atonement to brick is Exeter Library, where the brick is the structure. It's not a veneer over a concrete structure, but it's a masonry brick and block structure that holds the building up. It is the building. And he thinks that makes brick happy. And, you sort of, we get a little feeling for that, don't we? If you use something in a sloppy, disrespectful manner. The germ is the real thing, the seed of identity. There is an essence or identity in the germ. Now we call that, what do we call that in a materialist? What's making it become an oak tree or a peanut plant? DNA. There's DNA in there. That's how it's going to become an oak tree. It's not some mystical will, but we're speaking metaphorically. So we say there is an essence or identity in the germ. Within its delicate mechanism lies will to power. This essence has a will to power. What does that mean? It means it wants to express itself in form. I want to sit around being an acorn. I want to be a mighty oak tree. Oh, that one didn't make it. Somebody stepped on it. The acorn wants to be an oak tree. Materials call that DNA. Sullivan says, the office building must be every inch a proud and soaring thing. Now, elsewhere, Sullivan says, how can a inanimate thing want anything? How can steel want to be something? He says, of course it can't. It does it in interrelationship with the architect. So from that point of view, the architect is a midwife bringing the building into manifestation so that it isn't I express my will and I make the building that I want to make. No, I work with the situation and the client and the materials and the site, and I help it become what it wants to be from this point of view. Okay, so those are the key definitions that Wright gives. Actually, there's one more. I got to add it when I revise this lecture. And by organic architecture, at one point he says, he uses another term, but he means modern architecture. An architecture in which the aesthetic comes not from applying a historical suit of clothes like sticking Greek columns on it, but the aesthetic comes from an honest expression of the spaces, the materials, and the functions. So that's the definition of modern architecture, and it's one of his definitions of organic architecture. So now, an organic worldview. This is not just a way to see architecture, but it is a notion of who and what we are, what the world is, and how we are in the world. So, what is architecture? And I gave you my definition. Architecture is the crystallization of a culture in form. Frank Lloyd Wright expresses the same idea by saying, every great architect is necessarily a great poet. He must be a great original interpreter of his time, his day, his age. So, what is the age and how is that to be interpreted, expressed in form? Mies van der Rohe says, architecture is the will of an epoch translated into space. So by space he means buildings, and will of an epoch, the nature of a culture. So the Villa Rotunda expresses the humanist vision of the emergence of the individual human being in architectural form. How many people have seen any of Mad Men? So Mies expresses the bureaucratic world of Mad Men in the modern glass skyscraper. Notice, where would be the office of this is the Seagram building. Edgar Branson was the head owner, family-owned Seagram. Where is his office? Who knows? It's probably a corner, but it's not hierarchical, it's bureaucratic, which was the nature of that age. Now, I'm going to very briefly present an idea that should take an entire course. We're going to do it in 4 minutes, so with apologies, but it'll give us a basis to go forward. And I'm going to suggest that the Eurasian continent has 5 major culture fields. And this is very rough. It looks at the traditional cultures, and it conflates together a lot of individual countries. But we see in these different parts of Eurasia different worldviews. And we can associate with the West the notion of the emergence of an individual. And I'm going to suggest that culture expresses itself in its epic poems and its temple form. So that, well, let's go to Greece, and we would say, well, the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the myth of Prometheus might be a good one, and the Greek temple. So the Greek temple is representative of the separation of society from nature, and the columns are symbolic of the emergence of the individual from society. And in the story of Prometheus, we have Prometheus, who's a god, or rather a titan, standing in for human beings and asserting the individual in defiance of the gods, but subject to fate. And in the West, we have an individual that has an inner moral compass and is in a boundless experience of space, as we see in the Gothic cathedral. Contrast this, for example, with China, and we'll lump China and Japan together here as representative of this East Asian culture, in which we might take as key stories that of the Tao Te Ching, which describes that the underlying essence of all things is a flow, the Tao. And that includes the flow of nature, but it's the flow of all things. And we should put ourselves in harmony with that flow. And here we see in a Chinese temple, it's open, nature can flow through it. We also have, very representative, the story of Monkey, who is a superhero, very rambunctious, but always getting into trouble and has to be imprisoned, to be released, only to serve the greater community, where in the West, the individual makes their own moral decisions rather than having it made by the community. In India, with Buddhism, we have the notion that ultimate reality is the interlocked minds of all beings. And we can take as our architecture Borobudur, which is representative of the levels of consciousness as one approaches enlightenment. In the Middle East, including in the biblical traditions, we have a notion that the world was created by a creator who left instructions. And the point, what we're supposed to do is obey those instructions. We have the story of Job, who God allows the devil to abuse, and Job says, I bow down before you, rather than saying, knock it off. And the architecture presents this kind of cave that we exist within. So what we're going to see is how Frank Lloyd Wright relates these two. So let's start with the West. And I presented the idea that a culture begins by laying down its epic poems and its temple form. For the West, the temple form would be the Gothic cathedral. And I'm taking the West as beginning around 1000 to 1100 AD, and separate from ancient Greece and Rome. And the epic poems are the Arthurian romances, the tales of King Arthur and Knights of the Round Table. And we can go through many of them and see how they represent our ideal of what we should be doing as human beings. But I'll just describe one in which the knights are gathered at the round table, about to have supper, and the Holy Grail appears veiled. The Holy Grail is that spirit, they never say what it is, but it's that spiritual thing that everybody's seeking. And one of the knights says, I propose we take a vow to go on a quest to see the Holy Grail unveiled before we eat this supper. And they all agree, and they set forth, and they thought it would be a disgrace to go forth in a group. So each entered the forest at a point he himself chose, where it was darkest and there was no path or way. If there's a path, it's somebody else's path. So just to contrast that to some other cultures, I had a friend who's a Tibetan monk, and we were doing a studio here of a Tibetan cultural center for New York. So my friend Lobell agreed to come. He brought two buddies, all in their monk's robes. So they come swooping up to Pratt in their flowing monk's robes, and there's this big stir, and they sit on the jury, and they mostly nod and look confused. And later, I'm driving them back to New York, and Lobell says, every student does their own project? He was a great sand painter. He would never wing it. He doesn't make up sand paintings. They're all prescribed. I had another experience like that with a student from another culture. This hasn't happened recently, but a while back. I said, okay, for next week, chapter 2. So he comes in next week and says, that was a lot to memorize. So we don't, just sort of flip through it. So we demand that you be original. If you're not original, it's a very nasty word. What is it? Plagiarism. You get thrown out of school for that. So here's where that moral idea of your individuality originates in this culture. It's not necessarily in other cultures. In other cultures, you get in trouble for being original. Anybody here Japanese? So I'll just pick on the Japanese. Typically, we don't get a lot of Japanese because Japanese don't like to leave their culture. When we do, they're, pardon my language, weirdos. You know, they're people who don't fit in. And if you don't fit in, America's a great place to be. Japan is not. Because everybody in America doesn't fit in. So, you know, it's fine. And then we have the emergence of the individual and a domination of nature. So it's pretty clear here what's the person and what's nature? Now, maybe I stacked the deck by picking this painting, but that's sort of how we see art. It's about individual human beings. And then a home for that individual. So the Renaissance borrows from the Greek Protagoras the motto, man is the measure of all things. Now, if I'm going to say you are twice as far away from me as you, I have to know where I am, which is right here. So this architecture establishes a central standing point for the individual human being at the center of the X, Y, Z axes, from which we can then measure out and dominate nature. It's pretty clear what's the important thing here. Okay, that's the West. Very abbreviated. Now let's look at the East and pardon the cliched simplification, but we want to sort of build up these ideas to see something that's happening in Frank Lloyd Wright. So, in the Tao Te Ching, which is the great spiritual book of China by the legendary figure Lao Tzu, he opens with, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The Tao is the way of all things, the processes of nature, but beyond that, the processes of the universe. And at one point he says, do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not believe it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. So we want to be, not that China's doing that today, but we want to be integrated with nature, letting it flow through us and through our architecture. Can anybody tell me what geomancy is? Can anybody tell me what Feng Shui is? So geomancy and Feng Shui are the same thing. And Feng Shui is positioning and orienting your building and your spaces so that the flows of energy will work with you harmoniously. So if you face your door the wrong way, all your money will flow out the door. Or if you face your bedroom the wrong way, you'll have a bad relationship. So the idea is to orient your building in such a way so that the natural flows of energy which are there in nature will work harmoniously and beneficially with you and for you. And to this day, most Chinese developers will hire a geomancer to tell them you're doing the right thing with your building. And even if the developer doesn't believe that, one of the tenants might believe that. So you want to make sure you're doing it. So here is a Japanese painting. Somebody go up there and point to a person. Anybody find a people? You see someone right there? Very good. And here's some architecture. But look at how they are integrated with, instead of popping out from and standing apart from nature. Even to the point, even if we were doing a course about this, we look at some Western paintings in which the people might be that small, but they're going to pop. The way the brushstroke is done when they're doing people, particularly faces, is different, and it makes them pop from the nature. Here, they are integrated with and don't pop, don't stand out from, but are metaphysically the same as the natural background. So this is very briefly on Shinto architecture. Shinto is the native indigenous religion of Japan. If you're Japanese, you're Shinto. It's not something you believe in, it's just what you are. And Shintoism is sort of a nature religion and a religion of spirits, these native spirits that inhabit nature. And you might identify you know, that tree looks particularly powerful. It looks like, you know, very special. I'm feeling spirit energy with this tree. So we mark it with a rope, and then we put a fence around it so nobody will litter. And then maybe we build a little shrine there so you can leave some food there. There will be offerings to the nature spirits. So that's the beginning of a Shinto shrine. And the great Shinto shrine is Ise Shrine. And Ise Shrine can be referred to as the Parthenon of Japan. It's the most important building of Japan, just the way the Parthenon is one of, you know, the most important buildings of the West. And what do we observe? We observe natural materials, wood, the straw for the roof, but then it goes further than that. This building was first built in the 3rd century AD, so it's well over 1,000 years old. Now, how is a wood building going to last 1,000 years, particularly when no nails, no varnish, no paint? And the answer is it doesn't. What happens is it naturally decays. You see this green mold growing into the roof. Everything's turned brown. And then every 20 years they build a new one. And then they'll tear this one down. It'll sit empty. And then after 20 years, they'll build this one. And there's a very elaborate ceremony for the building. What might you do? Let's say you were really turned on by, oh, I'm interested in Ise Shrine. You said there's an elaborate ceremony for the building. What might you do when you get home? You go to YouTube, you put ceremony for building Ise Shrine. You can see the movie. I mean, you know, do we live in a great world or what? Used to be you had to go over to the library and see if they had a video you could check out. So we'll take this as exemplative of East Asian architecture. And even if you were looking at Beijing, a palace of a mighty, wealthy empire, it's all wood. Europeans are building Versailles in stone. The Chinese are building the Imperial Palace, the Forbidden City, in wood. They could afford it to build it in stone, but the wood puts you in harmony with these natural processes of nature. So here's an important example of Japanese architecture, Katsura Imperial Villa. So long story, there was an emperor, he didn't have any heirs, he adopted a son, he was trained to be the next emperor, and then the emperor got an heir. So what do we do with this guy? So build him a villa and he can study poetry. He can write poetry. So it's Katsura Imperial Villa. And what do we see? Asymmetrical, integrated into nature. The walls are made out of what? What are the walls made out of? A lot of them are made out of paper. So this is not giving us very much protection from the outside. And a flow between the inside and outside, the use of these natural materials which have to be renewed over the years. Integrating us with nature rather than battling nature and separating us away from it with thick stone walls. So, these are these two cultures. Now let's look at some of the contrasts. In the West, every hero is a dragon slayer. Hercules kills the Hydra. St. Patrick drives the snakes out of Ireland. They all slay dragons and rescue maidens. What is a dragon? The dragons are the children of the Earth Mother. So this is the egocentric dominating male figure asserting his power over and vanquishing the processes of the earth. What is the great technology whereby we do that? Science. Science now enables us to understand and control nature. In China, however, the dragon is venerated. It's a good omen. You don't slay the dragon. You know, the dragon is a good omen. In the West, the individual is differentiated from and dominates nature. In the East, integrated into nature. In the West, a villa for a nobleman, this is a villa for a nobleman in Japan. A villa for the nobleman sits on top of the hill, dominates nature, and lays down a Cartesian grid with which we can then control nature. In the East, integrated with nature, interpenetrated, flowing in and out. And here's a passage from the Tao Te Ching. I expand on what I read before from the East. Do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not believe it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. If you try to change it, you will ruin it. If you try to hold it, you will lose it. We'll be in harmony with. Let nature happen. Here's a book called The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil is the most important futurist of our time. He's got another recent book called How to Create a Mind. Why might he have a good chance of doing that? What job did Ray Kurzweil recently get? He used to have his own company. Now he works for somebody. He's chief scientist for Google in charge of artificial intelligence. Think Google's got the resources? So, yeah, they're out there building artificial intelligence. What's that stupid cylinder you talk to? What's it called? Yeah, it sits on your table and you say, turn on the TV, you know, or whatever. So, you know, Google's doing that stuff. Oh, that's Amazon, but Google's doing it too. And Apple has Siri. So, Ray Kurzweil writes, it may only take a quarter of a millennium, it's 250 years, to go from sending messages on horseback. So before the railroad, before the telegraph, the opening scene of McCullough's biography of John Adams has him leaving Boston to go to the Continental Congress Convention in Philadelphia. How does he get there? He's walking because it's too slippery. It's winter. It's too slippery to ride the horse. He's walking, leading his horse. That's how I got from Boston to Philadelphia. It's only a few years later, we're going to the moon. But that's just the beginning. From sending messages on horseback to saturating the matter and energy of our solar system with sublimely intelligent processes. Could be sprinkling computer chips all over the solar system with sensors and talking to each other. They're working, you know, they're doing it now. The ongoing expansion of our future superintelligence will then require moving out into the rest of the universe where we may engineer new universes. What's the technical term for that kind of talk? Hubris. So this is a book by Seth Lloyd. He's a professor at MIT in quantum theory. And there's some things that are not right about the universe, so he wrote a handbook, Programming the Universe. This is a group called 2045. They're Russian oligarchs. They're building avatars in which to download themselves. This is a project called Timeship. I'm director of research, and our clients decided not to die. They've spent over $100 million to find a genetic cause of aging and turn it off. So this is a research facility. If you don't make it, they'll be frozen here. So these people are thinking very different from these people. The West, the Rotunda, the East, Katsura. Which does Frank Lloyd Wright look more similar to? Maybe, yeah. So let's see where we're going with this. Well, the West has been going to the East. Admiral Perry opened Japan. The English and other powers colonized India and China. But the East has also been coming to the West. So 326 BCE, Alexander the Great invades India, and a lot of pre-Buddhist ideas are brought back to Greece and become Neoplatonism, which is foundational to Christianity. So even in Christianity are a lot of Eastern ideas. In the 1700s, the British go into India and discover Sanskrit texts. It takes them a while to get them translated. No one can translate from Sanskrit to Latin, but they can translate from Sanskrit to Persian, and then from Persian to Latin. And then philosophers like Immanuel Kant, that becomes the thing in itself that Immanuel Kant is talking about. Emerson and Thoreau make constant references to this Sanskrit material. In the 1800s, we see the Japanese influence on the West, including on Impressionist painting. In 1893, a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, a Hindu saint, goes to the Chicago World's Fair and ends up staying and influences the beginning of the Theosophical movement. Wright sees a Japanese temple at the fair. 1905, Frank Lloyd Wright goes to Japan to buy Japanese prints. 1915, Wright builds the Imperial Hotel. In the 1950s and 60s, the Beatniks and Norman Mailer and others are influenced by Zen Buddhism, brought back from Japan by returning World War II GIs. 1963, the first Tibetan meditation master, Chingam Trungpa Rinpoche, comes to the West. From the 1920s to today, we have quantum theory, which let's start thinking about its relationship to all this. This is a Japanese print where we have a hard time finding the people. This is Western art where the people are very clear. This is Impressionism. And these are trees, these are carriages, these are people. The people are not, they have people shapes, but they don't pop. They're not metaphysically different from other things. And so this is probably a Japanese influence. In Buddhism, the ultimate, if we said to a Western scientist, what ultimately is the universe made of? What's the ultimate stuff? And they'd probably say space, time, matter, and the laws of physics. 4 things. If you ask Buddhism that, they say the universe is the interlocked minds of all beings. Well, we start getting problems with quantum theory and relativity. In response to that, James Jeans, English physicist, writes, the universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. So Western science is starting to think that way. John Archibald Wheeler, very important relativistic and quantum theorist, writes, No phenomena is a real phenomena until it is an observed phenomena. Who can tell me what the paradox of Schrodinger's cat? Right. So something might or might not have happened. In other words, there's the atom has in the time we're talking about, has a 50% chance of giving off a gamma ray. If the gamma ray goes off, it breaks a bottle of poison and kills the cat. If it doesn't go off, the cat is still alive. Is the cat alive or dead? It is neither alive nor dead until we open the box and look. Now, if you do that experiment, it's going to be either alive or dead. But it's a point about quantum theory, which in a certain sense is true. So, if a tree falls in the forest, nobody hears it. Does it make a sound? We now know. It doesn't. You have to observe it for it to be real, or hear. So this is Robert Thurman. Anybody know what he's most famous for? He's Uma Thurman's father. But he is chair of Indo-Tibetan Studies at Columbia University and one of the most important Western Tibetan scholars. And he's buddies with the Dalai Lama. And he advocates or proposes that we're entering what he calls a second Renaissance. He says, with the Renaissance, the West mastered the outer world of material. In the meantime, the East mastered the inner world of mind. In the second Renaissance, we will bring the two together. So, here are some worldviews. Materialism. We are material creatures. Western individuals. We are unique individuals whose purpose is to fulfill our potential. The Middle East. We are created by a creator who left instructions. Indian Buddhism. We are part of a universal consciousness. Traditional Japan and China. We are part of the flow of nature. What was Wright's worldview? And I'm going to suggest these two. He partakes of both. So Frank Lloyd Wright says, I believe that every man born had equal right to grow from scratch by way of his own power, unhindered to the highest expression of himself possible to him. Boy, is that awkward writing. But, in other words, the individual should be able to flower and fully manifest and express themselves. He also writes, everything that's ever going to be of use to you in architecture or in life or anything or anywhere you go or whatever you do is going to be nature in some of its immensely varied forms. So I think that Wright brings these two traditions together in a unique way. Wright writes, space, the continual becoming. What does that sound like? The opening of Star Trek. Space, the continual becoming, invisible fountain from which all rhythms flow and to which they must pass, beyond time or infinity.